Hey everyone, it's nearly Christmas, so what better thing to do than to take our hobby and merge it with the festive period by making some Christmas decorations. I'm taking the Red Gobbo model, and what we're going to do is make a nice Christmas scene out of a bauble. Now, we could go and buy really expensive pre-made glass baubles and just pop a model in it, but instead, we're going to do the more fun option. We're going to take cheap baubles, and we're going to do some slight modifications with them, using one of these. Let's start off with the preparation of the baubles, and naturally we're going to need to make a hole in the bauble so that we can see into our scene later. I find it's generally easier to follow a line here, so what we're going to do is, with the quick application of a Sharpie circle, this will give us a nice guide that we can follow around with our rotary tool, which has a cutting wheel attachment. We can do this carefully, removing a circular section of the bauble. With that done, we can take a little bit of sandpaper and use this to smooth the recently cut edges, and also to remove some of the bauble paint to make any prime stick better later on. However, if you don't want to paint your bauble, all you need to do is just sand the cutout area and just make sure you buy the colour bauble you want at the end as your end result. With our bauble prepared, we can start to build out some area for our model and our scene to sit on. Naturally, this being a sphere, there's going to be a divot and recess in the bottom, and we can fill this in multiple ways, but here we're just opting for the simple process of a blob of green stuff pressed down, giving us a flat surface, which we can then glue a thin sheet of cork to, using a little bit of super glue. If we have any green stuff left, we can use this to fill any gaps around the edges where our cork is sitting, before we cover the floor in a thick layer of sand paste, which is going to give us a nice thick fluffy textured floor. At this point, we're going to need to set the bauble aside. We've used a relatively thick layer of paste in order to get that nice fluffy sort of texture that you would get from snow. And that is going to take a little while to dry. So we can just hang it up, leave it to dry, and get to work on the model that's going to be in the scene, which is this Red Gobbo, or the Red Gobbo, however it is. It's one of the commemorative Christmas models that Games Workshop release. I'm just going to be using the goblin from this boy, which is awfully convenient because it fits in the scene that I'm planning, and it also means that I don't have to paint the snowman and the other little goblin, which I can use for other projects later. What scene am I having in mind, you may ask? Well, the scene I'm imagining is the Red Gobbo walking through a field of snow with a forest behind him, chucking out his bombs. And that's what we're going to be doing, so let's start off by painting the goblin while the bauble dries. Our Gobbo is going to be starting from a blue to white zenithal. This is going to give us some nice cool shadows and a nice white top coat. Then we can start painting the jacket. We want this to be a nice bold Christmassy red, which means that we're going to add a little bit of contrast, and to do that we need to start from a deeper base. In this case, we're going to be mixing a dark red in with a little bit of a dark rich purple. And we're going to use this for our first round of base coating. Once we've gone round and we have a nice coat of this, we want to add a little bit more of our red to the mix. This will then be used to cover the majority of the coat, leaving our base coat in predominantly the folds and the recesses. At this point, we should be able to take our pure dark red and then add yet another layer following the lighter areas we've already mapped out. This will hopefully bring the overall jacket to more of a dark burnt red, as opposed to a reddish purple. In regards to highlighting, I'm trying to do it in more of a block manner. So what we're getting is nice consistent panels of light going down the model. This will give us a nice feel and a nice look of how light would actually interact with the object. Equally, when doing this, it's worth remembering, when highlighting in general, that using a stroke of your brush, generally the most amount of pigment will be deposited at the end of the stroke. So if we highlight in a way of where we expect the light to go, so we start from the dark and go to the lightest area, we're going to get the maximum benefit of the brighter amount of pigment being deposited in the brightest area. With the dark red applied, we can start to push the reds a little bit brighter. This time, what we're going to do is grab the brightest red that we have in our collection and start mixing this into the previously used dark red. Again, we want to then start working around and highlighting the same areas as we did with the dark red, but this time in smaller panels. Because we've mixed these colours together, we should get a smoother transition when moving from one colour to the next. In regards to the next, we're going to be grabbing a pure red, which is the brightest red from our mix, and doing this next highlight in this colour. What we want to be doing is very narrow highlights with this, getting a decent amount on the edges, going thinner and sharper on the most raised points, giving us those nice highlights along the edges. It's worth noting that we're using this red to get a decent amount of edge highlights, and we will be doing broad edge highlights with all of that bright red. And then we're going to be pushing it a tiny bit further, and the choice of colour here is a little bit important because we're going to be using it on multiple areas. What we're going to be doing is making a relatively harmonious highlight colour, in the form, in this case, a dark flesh, which is kind of a yellowy ochre flesh tone. We're going to be using this yellowy ochre flesh tone as our consistent highlight mix in all of the main areas, unless we're going for a little bit of subtle contrast. So what that means is we're going to be adding this into our bright red as our next steps of highlights. But because it's a yellowy ochre, it's going to desaturate and slightly pinkify the red. And obviously we don't want a pink coat. So we're going to have to be doing very careful, precise edge and spot highlights with this new mix. Let me show you what I mean. Taking our mix of this red and yellow ochre skin tone, what we want to do is select the edges as well as the sharpest areas which center the masses of any highlights. What we're going to be doing is hitting parts of the pockets, the edges of the coats, the tips of any raised folds. We need this to be an edge or a spot highlight, no more really than a thin line or a dot in the key areas that we want. This will give a small amount of definition and a tiny pop of brightness while keeping the coat an overall red tone. This solves one of the largest areas on the model, and we can instead move across to the clothing. Here we want to start with a brown contrast to give us a quick base coat, hitting the trousers, the boots, the bandolier, things like that for our little goblin. The trousers and bandolier are nice and simple to proceed. What we want to do is take our yellow ochre skin universal highlight tone and then mix this into our brown contrast, using that as our first highlight to broadly cover all of the trousers and bandolier, leaving the contrast predominantly in the shadows. We can then start to add a little more of our yellow ochre tone for our highlight, adding this to our mix and using this to catch the most prominent areas of the model. This leaves an optional step of a spot highlight using pure ochre. Just make sure that you keep your last mix ready at hand in case you go a little bit overboard and you need to use some thin coats of the previous step just to blend it down. This brings us to the boots on the model, and unlike the rest of the areas where we've used our dark flesh ochre universal highlight, we're actually going to be swapping this out because the boots need to look slightly different to the trousers. And the boots are nearer the floor, which is where the cold snow is. So what we're going to do is do a cooler highlight on the boots by grabbing a desaturated pale blue instead of our universal highlight, and using this in essentially the same way. Once we've mixed a little bit of our blue into our brown, we can do a simple one-pass highlight, catching all of the points of the shoes, as well as any smaller details we may want to pick out. We can then base coat the crotch cover using a dark blue-black contrast, and similar to the shoes, once it's dry, we can take that black contrast, add a little bit of our pale blue into the mix, and then use this to get a pale grey highlight tone that can be highlighted across all of the edges of the fabric folds. You might be wondering why we used the blue for the boot highlight as opposed to the universal highlight colour that we used everywhere else. And the reason for that is so that it ties it in more with the boots. If the boots were the only thing that had been highlighted with this desaturated blue, they might stand out a little bit too much. By adding that same colour into another area close to it, it ties those in nicely while also giving us a good separation on the trousers, which have been painted in the warmer tone. We've then got a cooler tone separating that down the middle. With that said, we do now need to tackle the skin of the model, which we could have done first and then we wouldn't have had to try and fight through everything we've already painted. But you live and you learn. I really wanted to paint the red coat first. And we could do this green skin with a green contrast, but we're actually going to be mixing up a green using a blue and a yellow contrast, and then applying that to our orc's skin. Well, our goblin skin anyway. However our green contrast comes about, what we want to do is apply a thin coat of this contrast all over the exposed skin of our goblin. Thanks to the blue zenithal prime that we did at the initial phase, we should get some nice rich shadows as the green contrast layers over the blue prime. We then want to start highlighting, and as we know, for that we don't really need to make a decision. We have our yellow ochre skin tone, and this can slowly be mixed into our green contrast base. The first layer can be relatively broad, essentially catching all of the lighter areas of contrast. With this applied, and once it's dried, we can add a little bit more ochre into the mix, and then come back in and apply a more narrow, focused highlight on all of the sculpted details. We are looking at elements like the nose, the cheeks, the fingers, and those little chest pecs. Finishing off the skin, we can do a final spot highlight with just the ochre on some of the most prominent features, but similar to the previous steps, just make sure you've got the last mix at hand, just in case we need to smooth out any of those spot highlights. With that done, we can move to the other main bulky area of the model, which is going to be the whites on the coats, the hat, and elements like that. However, before we do, I thought I'd just touch on the whole yellow and green, blue mixing of contrast so that we can make our own skin tone. And while it's not as beneficial in this particular model, because we're doing a one-off, the reason that I do quite like this as an option for skin tone for orcs is if we're painting an army, we can keep it consistent while varying the depth of the green, for example. So if we wanted to paint an orc army where we had the grots being a nice pale light green, and then the bigger and beefier the orcs get, the darker and richer that skin tone gets, we can achieve that by mixing the two contrasts. They'll still look cohesive because it's the same two colours being used, but for a darker orc we can add a little bit more of the blue, and for a lighter goblin or grot we can use a little bit more yellow. That way it all ties together nicely, but we can vary it from model to model without having to grab 3 different types of a green contrast. Now with all that said, let's jump to the fun bit, which is going to be some painting of the whites. The process is made slightly easier for us as we've used white as the top coat of our Zenithal Prime. However, this is not going to be a pure white, and we can take advantage of this by lightly overbrushing a pure white across all of those white elements, giving us a really quick highlight. Once that white is dry, what we're going to do is take a white contrast and apply a thin coat of this across all of the areas. This will help to harmonise those blue recesses from our Zenithal Prime and also darken our white overbrush. Because we've recently darkened our white overbrush, we can brighten it back up once it's dry. And to help sell that Christmassy shiny feel, what we can do is give it a quick overbrush, but this time using a glossy white to add that slight reflective shine. We can essentially do this the same for all of the white elements, even the beard. So the hat, the beard, the coat, everything like that can all get the same treatment of white. Now there are some elements on the model that are less important, very minor, and I don't think we really need to cover in a painting-y bit. But so that you know what I did, the goggles were essentially given a brown contrast. There's an earring on the model, and for the earring we just gave it a metallic-y mint green Christmassy feeling colour. And then we also have the smoke from the grenade that he's throwing. Now, personally, I hate painting things like smoke effects and things like that. I like to imagine they're there and not try and paint an ethereal, smoky type thing. However, it's on the model, so I kind of just copped out. What I did was left the Zenithal Prime that we already had, so the blue to the white, and then I got a green wash, slapped this over it just to add an extra little bit of colour, almost from a fuse or chemical within the bomb, glowing up and affecting the underneath. That was the theory. It's not a great deal to do. It's not a great way of painting smoke, but it gets it done for the model. With that said, we do have some metallics to paint, so let's jump across to those. For our metals, we're going to be starting off from a brown contrast, which, yes, is not a metal, but is perfect for a golden base coat. We do need to be careful when we're applying this because we naturally don't want to catch any areas around the components we're painting. We don't really want to be going in and repainting the white robe if we accidentally get some brown contrast on it. We can then follow up the contrast with a complete full coverage coat of a medium bright gold. This will give us a nice amount of golden reflection, and once that reflection is there, we can matte it out quickly with a nice red wash. This will also have the benefit of adding some warm shadows to the metals. Once the wash is dry, we're going to be finishing off the metals by going back to our initial base coat gold and then highlighting all of the edges of our washed metal, giving us a nice shine of gold and a pop of colour on that metallic. By the time we've done all that, our bauble should be dry, so what we can do is go out and give it a nice prime. Naturally, if you're not changing the colour of your bauble, you need to be a little bit more careful, whereas here we just gave it a nice black spray. It's worth remembering that we do need to prime the inside as well, which we're going to be doing with a white. And we could just leave it white for the entirety of the rest of it and just build our little scene on it. But instead, what we're going to do is get a little bit Bob Rossi, dig out some oil colours and paint a nice little scene. This is exactly what we're going to be doing here. Taking our primed bauble, we can mix up some oil paints. Here we're using a blue and a white mix to get a nice pale blue. We're also using a pure yellow and a pure white. A bit later on, we are also going to be needing a brown and a green. What we want to do is grab our bauble and a semi-firm round brush, dip this into our blue paint, and we can start to press it against the white sides of the bauble, roughly halfway up, and then start to fill up the sky with swirling patterns. Yes, a sky, that is what we're building. We can just paint a nice skyline and build it up to the top of our bauble. Once we have our blue sky down, we can start to take a little bit of our white and then blend this into the horizon, giving us that nice subtle change from the blue top sky to a snowy scene. Now, with our blue sky down and done, we need a little bit of sun. And for this, we can take our pure yellow and apply a thick circle somewhere in our sky section. Once that's down, we can slowly start to blot around the edge of the sun, blending this into our sky, giving us a nice light cascading off of elements in the air style effect. Just make sure when you're doing this that you don't overdo the blending and turn your sun into a green sun, unless you want a green sun, I guess. But if you're doing a yellow sun, make sure you've still got enough yellow and you're just kind of feathering out the edges. Because we're using oil paints, it should be workable for quite a long time, so you've got time to do this as needed. Let's add some little trees. First, we need a thin, stiff brush, and we're going to use this to paint in the brown lines, taking some brown oil and doing thin lines on our back. This will be the stumps of our trees. And naturally, trees always need company, so make sure to put down a fair few of these in a nice array which will simulate a forest. We can then start to build out the dark leafy green sections. This time, taking a stiff round brush, we can take a green oil and start to stipple this around our tree stems to give us a nice fluffy leaf feeling. Now with the background painted, we can start to assemble the overall bauble, and what I want to do is push the scene a little bit further. Rather than just having our goblins sat in our painted forest, I'm going to add a 3D tree to our scene on top of our 2D painted trees. And there are quite a few ways we could do this. I quite like the method of taking a mascara brush, cutting it off, painting it green, and if it's a snowy forest, putting some white speckles on it, and then using those. They're a nice small kind of shrub style, quite good for scenery. However, because it's Christmas, there's a lot of tat about, and we can pick up some potentially useful things. I went out and found for £2 this collection of 4 Christmas trees on a bit of wood. It used to come with lights. I've stolen the lights. I might use them for another project. But what we're going to be doing here is conveniently stealing the top of this tree, which is already nice and Christmassy. So all the work is done for us. We can just clip it off and get to work. We can take a strong pair of clippers and start to work through the wire of the fake tree. We want to naturally take the top of the tree so we get that nice pointy tree-looking tree effect. But we will need to trim away the lower leaf sections in order to create a trunk. At which point, we need to mount it into our scene. And this is just going to be a nice case of coating the metal pins of our little tree in super glue and then pushing this into our snow basing. Because of how we made the initial basing, it's just a cork base with some sand medium on top. It should punch through nicely, and the glue will stick into the cork layer below the snow. This is at the same way that we can apply our gobbo. We need to apply a little pin through his foot, making sure it doesn't come out the other side and ruin our paint job, and then we can mount him securely into the scene as well with a dab of super glue. Now we could do that, but before we actually stick our goblin in, but after we've stuck our tree in, we can do one final thing just to help sell that Christmassy, nice joy, glistening snow effect. And in order to do that, we're going to need a couple of things. And the first one of those is something really nice and simple, which is clear PVA. And the second one is actually silver glitter and glitter effect. What we're going to use is these two to make some nice glistening snow. We do want this glitter to be rather fine, and then we can start to mix it into our transparent PVA. Once we get it to a point of being a grey looking slurry, we can start to apply this in random sections and a stippling motion across our sandy snow base. This will firmly glue down those glitter elements into the various aspects of the texture paste, and when it's dry, it will give us a really nice slight shimmer, shine and glint when we rotate the bauble and light hits the elements of snow, giving us that realistic snow effect. Then all we have to do is pin our goblin into our bauble, as I said, and we are essentially done. Obviously, I went for a nondescript black bauble with our scene on the inside, and I really like how this came out. Overall, it took me about 2 days, maybe a little bit longer, and most of that was actually waiting for the sand paste to dry in our bauble so that I could paint the rest of the bauble. So overall, it's quite a nice quick project, and if you can think of a quicker way of making the bauble flat, then you could probably do it in a day and crank out a couple of these. Naturally, we bought this model, which also comes with a snowman, so I'm tempted to make another one and put the snowman in the second bauble. But this is a nice look of how it came out. This is the overall look of how it came out. And I genuinely think this is a much more creative and fun way of making these baubles, as opposed to just going and buying the really expensive display baubles and sitting a model in it. Yes, it can be nice to have your model on display like that, but we're hobbyists, we're crafters. It's fun to go out and make these things, and I genuinely did enjoy it. I appreciate that you kind of need a rotary tool for this, but you could potentially do the same with a small hobby saw and a lot more patience. With all of that said, I really do like how this came out. Let me know if this is the sort of thing that you would genuinely do, if you like how it came out, and what sort of scenes you would put inside your baubles, because we don't just have to use the GW Goblin Christmas model. We can use any model and make any sort of scene. Naturally, it doesn't even have to be GW, just my personal preference. With all that said, let's jump to another video. We're leaving you now, so why not check out this video here where we paint up an orc in the form of a scheme that's perfect for the goths. Otherwise, do remember to subscribe so that we can see you next time.